Now I'm going to go ahead and get the bottom end assembled. I'm going to start by pounding in some new freeze plugs. And these are going to get just a light film of this stuff on the outside diameter of the plug. And then I'm going to pound them just past the chamfer in each of the freeze plug ports. So there's one. You can see how I got it just right to the edge of that chamfer there. And now I'm going to pound the rest of them in. Next up, my old dipstick boss was really bent and cracked and messed up for some reason. So I was going to buy a new one from BMW, but the part is almost $40 for some reason. So I made my own instead with a piece of capillary tube, which is 15 millimeter outside diameter, 13 millimeter inside diameter, and then I cut it to 72 millimeters because that's what I measured the old one as. Turned down the end that goes into the block just a little bit. I took maybe, I don't know, 0.3 millimeters off of the outside diameter, and then I'm going to go stick this in the freezer because it's still pretty tight, and then it'll kind of be an interference fit. Tapped it all the way home and then went ahead and put some of that motorcycle case sealant around that joint. So I remember checking the mains with Plastigauge once already, but that was a while ago, so I want to make sure at least one of them is okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pull number one here and check it, see what it looks like. So I'm just going to dry off the assembly lube from the journal and from the bearing surface, and then we'll go ahead and Plastigauge it. So now I have my 1/1000 to 3/1000 Plastigauge, and I'm going to take just a little piece of it. Now I'm going to put just a little bit of oil on the block side of my ARP main studs. Thread those into place. And those are getting just a hair more than finger tight. And now I can throw my cap back on, and if I ever forget which way they go, the side where this piece is smooth faces forward, and the side where there's a number on it faces the back of the engine towards the flywheel. Now I'm going to take a little bit of ARP assembly lube and put it on the threads of the studs. And now I'm going to go ahead and torque these in 3 steps to 60 foot-pounds. And of course that's going to be different if you're using stock bolts, but with the ARP stuff it's going to be 20 foot-pounds, then 40 foot-pounds, and then 60 foot-pounds. Alright, now let's pull them back off and see what we got. I'd say we're pretty much right at 2/1000, which is what we want. So that's perfect. Now I'll go ahead and get this cleaned up, and then I'm going to check one more thing on the crankshaft before we move on. Another little thing is for lubricating the bottom end bearings. I'm using a mixture of 50-50 assembly lube and engine oil. The thrust bearing is in the middle, and you can sand the thrust bearing on, let's see, it's better to do it on this side because when you push in the clutch you're forcing it this way, so it's better to have more of the bearing surface over here that's unmessed with, and sand this side just a little bit. And a good way to do that I've seen is you take two of the caps and then you clamp the thrust bearing halves together like that, and then keep it really straight, and then put them on a flat surface with a little bit of really fine sandpaper or emery cloth, and then just kind of gently work it back and forth until you get the clearance that you need. In this case, our target is 4 to 5 thousandths. So I got my indicator here on the snout of the crankshaft, and when I move it back and forth, there we go. I've got pretty much right at 5 thousandths. Another little tip with regards to the thrust bearing is, prior to doing the final torque on this, just give it a couple taps, a couple gentle taps on this end to kind of seat the thrust bearing nice and flush in this direction, and then you can torque it. And then as far as the way that I torque these, the manual doesn't really say anything, but I start in the middle and then work my way to the end of the crankshaft when I'm not doing plastic gauge. And once again, since these are ARP studs, I did them in 3 steps: 20 foot-pounds, 40 foot-pounds, and then 60 foot-pounds. But those numbers are going to be different if you're using stock bolts. The oil pump support sits just like that. The offset side faces forward. These 2 studs are actually M50 head studs, and they need to be, because they have to be longer in order to fit this piece. And then once it's fully assembled, obviously it should turn nice and smooth by hand with no binding whatsoever. It should just be gravy the whole way around. And as you can see, I already put the pilot bearing into place, so I won't have to deal with it later. Now it's time to plastic gauge the rods. So I've got my 1 thou to 3 thou plastic gauge here. I went ahead and measured the length of all of my ARP rod bolts, just as a reference in the future, in case I want to reuse these. I can see how much they've stretched or fatigued over time. So that's what they measured at. And then of course I know which bolt is which, because the oil hole just below the bush faces towards the timing chain. Now I'm going to take a clean rag, clean up the journal of the crankshaft, the insides of the rod and the cap, the bearings, back shell, and the bearing surface. Next thing I'm going to do is zero out my rod bolt stretch gauge. And the way that I'm going to do that is, there's a dimple in both ends of the rod bolts, and I'm just going to set this up like so, and then I'm going to zero it. And as long as they're both within like 1/1000th of each other, it should be good. Next, I'm going to install the bearings. It's really critical to make sure that there's not any grit in here, or it's going to mess everything up. Just making sure that they're in there properly and indexed. And you can see I marked all my rods before I disassembled them. This is number 1. And in case I forget, I know that the index marks are on opposite sides. I'm just going to take a piece of padding, in this case some vinyl, and I'm going to wrap it around this part of the rod, just like that, and then zip tie it. And the reason that I do this is in case I slip while I'm working, the rod isn't going to knock the bore and damage it. Next thing I'm going to do is open up my plastic gauge. So that's how I'm going to have my plastic gauge, just like that. And now at this point, I really need to make sure that the rod doesn't rotate on its journal at all. Next thing I'm going to do is take a little bit of the ARP assembly lube, and I'm going to put it on the threads of the nut and the bolt. And now when I'm tightening these, I'm really just going to be moving my wrench or my torque wrench just that much, because if I try going this direction, it's going to shift everything and it's going to move the crank. Now I'm going to go ahead and torque them to 50 foot-pounds and then see how much they've stretched, and then I'm going to stretch them a little bit more, 7.5 thousandths to 8 thousandths. Then I'm going to take the cap off and see what my bearing clearance is. So as you can see, I got them stretched to where they need to be. So now I'm going to pull the cap off and measure that plastic gauge. So it's not exactly textbook. Some of it's stuck to the rod bearing, which is annoying, but sometimes it happens. And I can still get a decent measurement here. So it looks like we're in between 1.5 and 1/1000th, which is about what we're shooting for. So now I'm going to go ahead and repeat this process for all of the rod journals. Oh yeah, and a little bit of WD-40 and a rag melts it right off. Now it's time to get some slugs in the bores. First step, I'm going to take a bunch of clean engine oil and wipe down the bores. Just engine oil, no assembly lube. Alright, now it's time to get the ring package installed. With this ring package, you can't see, but there is a marking that says N75, and those markings need to face up. This is the first compression, second compression oil control, and then the oil ring package here consists of 3. So as usual, I'm going to start with the bottom. Now I'm going to get the expander ring on, and I don't think it matters all that much, but I'm going to offset these just as you do with the compression rings, because why not? And then another one of these. Alright, now this one is the biggest ring, and I think it's going to be best to use pliers with this one. So we'll see how she does here. Alright. Next I'm going to go ahead and install the wrist pin retainer rings. I'm going to do that just like this. There we go. Just looking at the valve reliefs, the bigger one is obviously going to be the intake side because the intake valves are a lot bigger. So I know that since the intake valve needs to face me and the connecting rod's oil drain hole needs to face the timing chain, I know the orientation that these two need to go together. Alright, next it's time for some oil in the bushing. On the wrist pin, and a little bit in the wrist pin bores as well. And now it's time for the other lock. Now it's time to lubricate some bearing surfaces. Alright, journal's at bottom dead center. Now I'm going to go ahead and flip the whole engine. Next I'm going to get a little bit of oil in my piston ring compressor. And I'm just triple checking that I got it right. Oil hole faces the timing shade side, and the bigger valve recess faces the intake side, so we're good. And of course, one thing I forgot to mention is that I'm putting the ring gaps at 180 degrees of each other for the best seal. So sorry you couldn't really see what I was doing underneath, but my other hand I was underneath up inside the bore and just supporting the end of the conrod and guiding it into place on the crank journal. And then I just put one nut on it to secure it, and now I'm going to do the same thing that I did when I checked the clearances. I'm going to put a little bit of ARP lube on the threads. Now I'm good to remove the other one and put a little more ARP lube on it. And now I'm going to run through that process that I did earlier all over again. I'm going to zero my stretch gauge, torque these to 50 foot-pounds, and then if they haven't stretched to 8 thousandths, I'm going to finish stretching them to 8 thousandths, and then we're good to go. So I'm going to repeat this whole process 4 times, and then the rotating assembly will be in. Next, it's time to do the rear main. A couple things to keep in mind here. So those gouges are from where the old lip seal was riding. So I'm going to make sure that I press my new seal into the housing in such a manner that those lip seals ride somewhere else. And the way that I'm going to do that is I have my seal kind of started there, as you can see. And since those gouges were closer to the inside of the crankshaft, or this side of the housing, I'm going to go ahead and just tap on the back side of the housing until the seal is flush against the face of it, and that way it'll be nice and square, but that lip seal will ride somewhere else and I won't have a leak. And so I don't mess up the housing, I'm just going to use a wood block on the back of it and then just tap in the middle until it's home. Alright, I got her punched into place here, and my gasket surface is cleaned up. Same on the block. So now I'm going to go ahead and install my new paper gasket here and put just a little bit of oil on the lip seal and then push it into place. Now I'm going to go ahead and torque the larger 2 bolts to 17 foot-pounds and the smaller 4 to 8 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install the oil galley plug here in the back. And now I couldn't find a torque spec for this, so I'm just going to tighten it until I see that crush washer squish. 25 feels pretty nice. So I spent the better part of a day messing around with this crank scraper. I had to cut a bunch of the surfaces to get it all to fit. Actually, pretty much every single surface, which is a little bit annoying, and it's a little bit disappointing actually, because the bolts that locate this thing are the same bolts that attach the oil pan to the bottom of the block, and there's enough play in them that if I were to clearance this thing enough so that no matter where on the bolts it sits, it wouldn't even really be doing much. So I kind of had to mark on the block where exactly I want this thing to sit so that I could then, you know, cut everything to clearance. This is about where she sits. First thing I had to do is I had to cut this hole bigger so that the dipstick boss in the block there would actually fit. So that's good now. So I did that, and then after that I clearanced each of the counterweight scrapers. Had to cut quite a bit out of all of those, and then I sharpened the backside. And the clearance number that Ishihara Johnson gave me for everything in the rotating assembly is 1 millimeter clearance from all of this. So I'll turn it over and I'll show you on one cylinder what all I was looking for to make sure that it's right. Alright, so the first thing in the stroke here, you'll see there's this little cutout here for the rod bolt that catches a bunch of the oil, so I had to make sure that we have a millimeter on all three sides of that. Next, we're coming around in this direction. Got to make sure that we've got enough clearance on either side there, which we do, and it looks good. And then as I'm still coming, I'm still checking along the rod cap here as well. So that all looks good. And then once the counterweights come around, I got to make sure I got that millimeter there, and then scraping the counterweights as well right in there. So doing that for all four took some time. Basically I just had to, you know, get it to where it would turn first, so I cut a bunch of material out there, and then just from there I started marking with a Sharpie approximately how much I had to grind. So I'd grind it, put it on, check everything, find that it was too tight, grind it again, put it back on. So now we're at the part where I have it all ground and it's good. And then I also had to mess with these to get them to open and shut more cleanly. But I think that this is just going to be worth the trouble, hopefully. I spent a lot of hours doing it, but this is a good system here. I think it's going to snap shut whenever oil sloshes against it, and then it'll still be able to drain from the head as it's coming down the side of the block. It took some work, but this piece is ready, and now I'm just going to go ahead and deburr it, and then we'll move along with the build here. Quick little note about oil pumps. This is a brand new one, but they don't always have this. This is a little sacrificial steel piece that goes there so that you're not wearing out this part, because this part is super expensive, and I don't know if you can even get it anymore. So instead of wearing this out, make it so that this is reusable each time by using that steel sacrificial piece. I also went ahead and packed the rotor with a little bit of that half and half assembly grease that I've been using. And then when I put the body back together, I'm going to Loctite the bolts. And I couldn't find an official torque spec, but I'm going to go ahead and use 8 foot-pounds. I couldn't find a definite reference, but I'm going to go ahead and torque the bolts that mount the pump to the block to 17 foot-pounds. Alright, now it's time for the oil pump support stuff. I'm going to put 2 regular M6 washers on these studs first, followed by the support bracket, just like so. I've seen this done different ways, but this is just how I'm going to do it. And then I'm going to take the 2 M6x1 bolts and put split lock washers on them. Give them just a little bit of blue Loctite, and then install them down there. And now I'm going to throw the little spacers up top. To finish it off, I picked these little all metal lock washers instead of the nylock insert that some guys will use. Now I'm going to torque these little guys to 8 foot-pounds. And the same up here. Like I said, I've seen guys do it other ways, but that's the way that I wanted to do it. Now it's time to install the oil pump drive sprocket and chain. And before I do that, I need to go ahead and take this special hardened washer and install it just like so. Followed by the sprocket. This is the splined variety, the later variety. There's also a 3-bolt design. And I just make sure that my chain is aligned on the crank sprocket, and then gently lift it into place here. And then I'm going to take a screwdriver and slowly turn the shaft a little bit until the splines are aligned, and then I can press it into place. So actually, looking at it with the torque down, it looks like it has just a little bit more play than I want. So I'm going to go ahead and add 1 shim under the oil pump. So let me rewind real quick and then we'll get back to this point. So we're back in business. Torqued everything back the way it needs to be. And I only had to remove those 2. I could leave this alone. While I was making adjustments, I ended up adding 2.1 millimeter shims underneath. So the specification that I've seen is no more than 10 millimeters of total play. And I mean, it should feel similar to like a motorcycle chain, maybe just a little bit tighter. But basically the way that I'm measuring this is I'm just gently pushing the chain all the way one direction and then gently pushing it the other direction. And I'm getting a total of about 9 millimeters of play, maybe closer to 8 millimeters of play. And that's about what I want. And you can also just kind of do it by feel. Like, that feels pretty good to me. And then, like I said, super important to have that hardened washer back there so that I'm getting full spline engagement with the sprocket. Got the threads cleaned up. And this is a special little step here, but I took the nut here and I went ahead and drilled a hole through one of the corners. And I'm going to use that for safety wire in a moment. But first I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on this and then torque it to 25 Newton meters or about 18.5 foot-pounds. Torquing it is a little bit tricky. I'm just using a brass punch through one of the lightning holes to hold the sprocket in place. And then I got my torque wrench underneath here. Now it's time for some safety wire. In my case, I drilled mine for 40 thousandths because it's really strong. Now I'm just going to go ahead and turn the engine over a few times and make sure that I'm happy with everything still. Make sure that the slack doesn't change too much based on where I turn it to. Make sure that my safety wire doesn't chafe on anything. And then also ensure that the alignment between the drive sprocket on the oil pump and the sprocket on the crankshaft there is nice and straight. Now it's time to install the pipe that supplies pressure from the pump to the oil galley, and I'm going to be using some new O-rings for that. So they're both going to get a little bit of oil on them. Got to make sure it's all the way seated, and then the other one goes in here. Couldn't find much on the torque spec for this, but I'm going to send it at 17 foot-pounds. Now it's time to get this thing set to top dead center. Now it's time for new timing chain stuff, including a new guide rail and tensioner rail as well. E-clips are in place. Now we need just a little bit of pre-lube on everything. Now it's time for the new chain. And the last thing I did is just throw a zip tie through this link here to make sure that the chain doesn't drop off of the crank sprocket when I turn the engine over. Now it's time to prep the timing chain cover, the lower one here. And I had this one machined with the block back in the day, but it doesn't have a bung welded for the turbo return. So I decided to use the old one instead. I pulled it off of the car, and that meant that I had to have this machined separately. But thankfully I know a guy. I just figured out, you know, where it was high and low, and then we got a rough estimate, and it should be close enough. So now I'm going to go ahead and press in the new crank seal. Just going to get it started like this, and then flip it over, tap it into place. Seal's pressed in, good to go. Now I'm going to go ahead and butter up these surfaces with a little bit of ultra black and their corresponding mating surface on the block is also going to get some. Then I'm going to stick the gaskets to the block and install the timing cover, and then I'm going to torque the M8 bolts to 19 foot-pounds and the M6 bolts to 8 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to butter up the mating surface of the water pump and the lower timing chain cover there where it mates to it with some ultra gray, and then install the new gasket and get everything torqued down. And it's the same torque specs as with the rest of the lower timing cover bolts, 8 foot-pounds for the 6mm stuff and 19 foot-pounds for the 8mm stuff. So this next step depends on your ignition setup. I have a O2 again pulley setup with the 36-1 trigger wheel. So I need to make sure that the pickup gap is correct. So I'm just going to install this real quick. Now I'm going to take a 0.65mm feeler gauge, stick it in between the pickup and the wheel, get it nice and centered. It's okay if I lose top dead center a little bit, that's alright. I'll get it back in a second. I'm going to put Loctite on this later. I'm just using it to hold it in place for now. Quick little tidbit here. If you made your own 36-1 trigger wheel, it's going to look like this at top dead center. So you have your missing tooth, and then count counterclockwise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 teeth, and then that should be aligned with your VR sensor here. Now we're getting to the point where I can go ahead and get the oil pan on, but quick little note about these. People tend to over tighten them and then it mushrooms this side of all the bolt holes. And a quick way to check for that is actually to take two punches that are, you know, flat sided and then put one on either side. See how it rocks back and forth on that bolt hole? So that's no good, and this thing will never seal properly. So what I do to fix this is I just keep my punches like this, and then I take a pair of channel locks and squeeze until they are all flat. Or if that doesn't work and they're like really messed up, you can always use a ball peen. I had to do that for a couple of mine that were really bent, but now all of the bolt holes are nice and flush and should seal nicely. So I've got my crank scraper propped up so I can access both sides of it. So I'm going to take some motorcycle case sealant and butter both sides, set that down, install my new pan gasket, followed by the pan, and that surface and this top surface of the scraper are going to get just a little bit of black RTV. And then I'm going to go ahead and install the 21 pan bolts, and those all get torqued to 8 foot-pounds. Now, when I torque these, I'm going to do them in a star pattern, starting in the middle and then working my way diagonally to the edges. Now it's time for the drain plug and the new crush washer. And the torque spec for this is listed at 43 foot-pounds, which might seem a bit excessive, but that's what the manual says. Now it's time to install the oil filter head with the new gasket. And I'm going to go ahead and torque these to 19 foot-pounds. Now I'm just going to double check that we're at absolute top dead center here. Now it's time for some head studs. Almost forgot about my dowel pins. Those get tapped into place right here and right back here. Alright, now we're ready to get this thing buttoned up. Got my head surface double checked and cleaned up. I double verified that we're still at top dead center. The alignment dowel faces down and the alignment tick mark faces up with the casting. In regards to the camshaft there, I got my new head gasket here. And this is how I'm going to torque it. I got my torque wrench exercise, meaning I set it to half the max of the scale and then worked it, and then that's all good. This is the order of operations here, with this being the front of the engine. I'm gonna, you know, torque in the middle first and then follow this order all the way across. And the first step, it's going to be 3 pretty even steps here. It's going to be 40 Newton meters, and then I'm going to wait an hour for everything to relax, torque it back to 40 Newton meters because it'll relax a little bit. And then the next step is 72. Again, wait an hour for it to relax, hit it to 72 again, and then go up to 110 Newton meters, wait another hour, and then torque it to 110 Newton meters for the final time. And this is just an arbitrary number. I mean, you can wait any amount that you feel like, really, but it just has to relax a little bit, in my opinion. But before I do that, I need to put just a little bit of black RTV, the ultra black Permatex stuff I'm going to use, and I need just a little dab there and a dab there, and then a super thin layer on the bottom timing cover there. And then I'm going to put just the tiniest amount of ultra black around the drain back holes here. And then again, just a tiny bit around there as well on both sides. Alright, got the tiniest bit of butter around the drain back there. And this one here. Got a little bit of butter there that I was talking about. Now I can go ahead and throw the head gasket on. Made sure that the head is fully through on the dowels. Wouldn't want to try and torque it while it's slightly cockeyed. Now it's time for some ARP washers. Once again, for the special ARP lube, gonna get it on all the threads. And now it's time for some nuts. Alright, and let's go ahead and get on the first step here. And now, since in this instance I have just a little bit of RTV that's kind of going to be curing here soon, I'm going to go ahead and cut these relaxation times down quite a bit. I'm going to wait like maybe 10 minutes and then do my double check at 40 Newton meters, and then I'll move up to my 72, another 10 minutes, 72, and then 110, and then I'll probably wait like 30 minutes. Now it's time to install the cam sprocket, and to do that I'm just going to carefully cut my zip tie retaining the timing chain here, and then I'm going to gently maneuver everything into place without disturbing anything, or at least that's the plan. So if I had the parts, I would use these flat pieces of sheet metal to lock down these retaining bolts, but these are NLA the last time I checked, so I'm actually going to do it a different way. I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on these, and I have split lock washers on all of them, as you can see, and then I'm going to torque them to 8 foot-pounds. Drilled a little hole in them all, and that is for safety wire, just like I did on the oil pump. I'm going to do the same thing with these. This one is being pulled clockwise, which is pulling this one clockwise, and as you can see, this is really tight. So now I'm just going to do the other one real quick. Now it's time to install and bleed the new timing chain tensioner stuff. So I got my end cap and crush ring there. This is a new crush ring. Got my new spring and my new piston. One thing to check with this is that they installed the little check ball. And now the fork on this thing goes in like that so that it interfaces with the tensioner rail, just like this. And now with the spring, the tapered end is supposed to face the plug. And now, if you look down in here, you'll see that there's a little oil pocket that I'm going to fill up here. And then I'm just going to work this back and forth until it firms up. Once it's bled and it feels pretty stiff, like there's some hydraulic pressure behind it, it's good to go ahead and torque this to 29 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the upper chain cover. So I'm going to go ahead and butter the top of the head gasket just a little bit. And then the corners are actually going to get a pretty good sized glob. Now I can go ahead and install the cover with the new gasket stuck to it there. Now I'm going to go ahead and torque these to 8 foot-pounds, starting with this one, then this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and then the lower two. There's still a good chunk of stuff I have left to do. I need to set the valve lash, I need to torque the crank pulley, I need to paint the block, I need to install all of the hardware in the head, I need to set the plug gap, I need to install the flywheel, I need to either mill this out or put a nice big dent in it so that it clears the top of this stud here. I need to show you my oil filter setup. Need to install my adapter for the oil pressure sender and the turbo feed. But we'll get to all of that in part 3.